The sun was only beginning to rise over the endless plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and pale pink. The land stretched wide and quiet, a place where silence carried more weight than words. And in the middle of that lonely vastness stood a small wooden cabin built by a man who had known little else in life but work, silence, and solitude. He was known by the nearby townsfolk simply as the rancher. No wife, no family, no children, only cattle and the call of coyotes at night. He was in his late 20s, a man strong from labor but awkward around people, especially women. The whispers in town had branded him a virgin rancher, not as a cruel insult but as a fact that reflected his life of isolation. Every morning, his routine was the same. He'd rise before dawn, step into his boots, and walk out to the corral. The creak of wooden fences, the low grunt of cattle, the smell of leather and dust. These were the only companions he had ever known. After feeding the herd, he would sit alone at his wooden table, eating biscuits and beans by the dim light of an oil lamp. And as he chewed, he sometimes wondered what it might feel like to share this table with another soul. But the frontier was not kind to dreamers. Survival left little room for yearning, and so he swallowed those thoughts and lived quietly, a shadow in the wide open land. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the prairie, something unusual caught his eye. At first, it was no more than a flicker of movement, near the tall grass. He thought perhaps it was a stray calf, but as he rode closer, reins tight in his calloused hands, his breath caught. It wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She looked no older than 12, perhaps 14 at most. Her hair was long and dark, braided loosely, and her clothing was unmistakably native, made of buckskin, fringed at the edges though torn and dirty from travel. Her feet were bare and blistered, and her face was streaked with both dirt and tears. The rancher pulled his horse to a stop a few paces away, his instincts torn between caution and compassion. The frontier was a dangerous place. A white man found with an Indian child could mean war if her people misunderstood. Yet the sight of her, tired, frightened, and utterly lost, struck something deep within him. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of him, but she did not run. Instead, she swayed on her feet, weak from hunger and exhaustion. She spoke then, in broken English, just a single word. Water. The rancher hesitated only a moment before dismounting. From his saddlebag, he pulled out his canteen and held it out to her. She drank desperately, as if it were the first drop she'd tasted in days. And in that quiet, fading light of evening, the rancher knew his solitary world was about to change, forever. The girl lowered the canteen slowly, water dripping from her chin, her small hands trembling as if afraid it might be taken away. She looked up at the rancher with eyes both wary and pleading, eyes that carried the weight of miles traveled. Alone, the rancher studied her carefully. She was young, far too young to be wandering the prairie without family. Her clothing was worn thin, the beadwork faded, the buckskin torn at the knees. Around her neck hung a single string of beads, though half the strand had broken, leaving loose pieces tied hastily together. It told him one thing: she had left home in a hurry, or perhaps she had been taken and somehow escaped. He knelt down slowly, not wanting to startle her. "You lost?" he asked in a gentle voice. She blinked, tilting her head as if trying to make sense of his words. Then, in halting English, she whispered, "Home." Far. The rancher glanced toward the horizon. The nearest town was at least a half-day's ride. But this girl wasn't from any settlement. Her dress, her braids, everything about her spoke of the nearby tribes. That thought made his stomach tighten. Relations between settlers and the native people were uneasy at best. Some ranchers had lost cattle to raids. Others had taken harsher measures, sparking feuds that lasted for years. To bring a native child onto his land, or worse, be caught with her, could mean danger beyond imagining. And yet, could he leave her here? Alone, starving, defenseless? His conscience wouldn't allow it. He stood and gestured toward his horse. "Come," he said, motioning with his hand. "Food. Shelter. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting from him to the animal, then back again. Slowly, she nodded. He lifted her carefully onto the saddle, settling her in front of him. She weighed almost nothing. Back at his cabin, the girl ate hungrily, devouring bread and beans with her hands until her stomach could hold no more. The rancher said nothing, just sat across from her, watching. In the flicker of lamplight, he noticed how her eyelids drooped with exhaustion. When she finally lay down on a blanket by the fireplace, curled into herself like a small animal, the rancher remained awake. He sat by the window, his rifle across, his knees staring out into the night. Doubts clawed at him. What if her people came looking for her? What if they thought he had taken her? The image of war parties sweeping down on his cabin made him grip his rifle tighter. He was just one man. He would never stand a chance. But then his gaze drifted back to the girl. She slept soundly for the first time in who knew how long. Her face softened in the firelight. She looked like any child, innocent, vulnerable, undeserving of harm. The rancher exhaled slowly. He made a decision then, one that would set the course for everything that followed. At first light, he would take her home, no matter the risk. The first light of dawn spilled across the plains, washing the land in soft gold. The rancher was already saddling his horse, his movement steady but his mind heavy with thought. Inside the cabin, the girl stirred awake, rubbing her eyes with small, tired hands. When she realized he was preparing the horse, she rose quickly, clutching her blanket as though afraid he might leave her behind. He pointed toward the horizon. "Home," he said simply, touching his chest, then gesturing outward. The girl nodded slowly, understanding. She stood, her thin frame swaying, and walked toward him. He lifted her once again onto the saddle, placing her in front. She gripped the horn tightly, her knuckles pale as though afraid she might fall. The prairie stretched before them, vast, unforgiving, and full of silence. The rancher kept the horse at a steady pace, conserving strength for the long ride. In the Almer, girl said little, but he caught her glancing back at him often, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity. By midday, the sun burned hot and the air shimmered above the grasslands. The rancher stopped near a creek, letting the horse drink before filling his canteen. The girl crouched beside the water, cupping her hands to drink. For a moment, her expression softened, almost playful, as she splashed cool drops over her face. Hoyer handed her a strip of jerky, which she accepted with both hands. She chewed slowly, then pointed toward the horizon and spoke a word he didn't understand. She repeated it, tapping her chest. He realized she was telling him her name. "Ah," he said, nodding. He tried repeating it, his tongue clumsy with the syllables. The girl giggled, soft, quick, almost shy. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it stirred something inside him. That night, they camped beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The rancher built a small fire, its glow pushing back the darkness. As he sat sharpening his knife, he heard a low growl from the edge of the trees. His eyes snapped up, hand reaching for his rifle. The girl froze, her breath caught. A pair of glowing eyes reflected from the shadows. A wolf. Then another. The rancher rose slowly, rifle in hand, stepping in front of the girl. The wolves edged closer, teeth bared, but he fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed across the plains. The animals yelped and vanished into the night. The girl clutched his arm tightly, trembling. He looked down at her, meeting her frightened eyes. Slowly, he set the rifle aside and draped his coat around her shoulders. She relaxed against him, her breathing slowing. For the first time in years, the rancher felt the warmth of another human leaning against him, trusting him. They traveled. For 2 more days, the land shifting from open prairie to rolling hills. The girl pointed more often now, naming rivers and trees in her language, teaching him words he couldn't quite pronounce. He listened anyway, nodding, sometimes repeating the sounds just to see her smile. By the 3rd evening, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. In the distance, faint smoke rose from campfires. The girl's eyes lit with recognition. She straightened in the saddle and whispered something softly, almost reverently. Home. The rancher slowed the horse, his chest tightening. He had done what he promised. He had guided her back. And yet, as they descended toward the valley, he felt a pang of something unexpected. In only a few days, her presence had broken the silence he had carried for years. At the edge of the valley, figures emerged, women, children, warriors, all rushing toward the girl. She slipped down from the saddle and ran to them, her braids flying behind her. Cries of relief and joy filled the air as she was gathered into the arms of her people. The rancher remained on his horse, watching quietly. He felt both relieved and strangely hollow. When the girl looked back at him one last time, her eyes shining with gratitude, she raised her small hand in farewell. He touched the brim of his hat in return. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and rode back toward the lonely horizon. The rancher returned home under the cover of night. His cabin stood small and lonely against the endless prairie, its walls weathered by years of storms and silence. He unsaddled his horse, brushed it down, and stepped inside, too tired to light a lamp. The fire still held a faint glow, enough to warm the room. He dropped into the chair by the table, his body aching from the journey, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, but when dawn broke, it was not the usual sounds that stirred him, not the bawling of cattle, not the rustle of prairie wind. Instead, it was silence, a silence so heavy it pressed against his chest. The rancher sat up slowly, his instincts prickling. Something was wrong. He reached for his rifle, his boots scraping against the floorboards as he crossed to the window. He pulled back the curtain, just an inch, and froze. Outside, the land was not empty. It was filled. Hundreds of figures stood still as stone, surrounding his cabin in every direction. Warriors, native warriors, painted, feathered, armed with spears, bows, and rifles. Their numbers seemed unending, stretching out like a living wall across the prairie. The rancher's throat went dry. He counted quickly in his head, dozens, no hundreds, 300 at least. They did not shout. They did not move. They only stood there in utter silence, their dark eyes fixed on the cabin. The rancher backed away from the window, heart pounding. He had known this might happen. Returning, the girl should have meant peace, but perhaps they thought differently. Perhaps they believed he had harmed her, or worse, that he had taken her against her will. He gripped his rifle tighter, the wood warm beneath his palms. He could bar the door, load every round he had, and make them pay dearly before they ended. But against so many? It would be suicide. His cabin creaked as if under the weight of that silence. He felt the air thicken, heavy with the unspoken. Then, hoofbeats. From the sea of warriors, one rider broke forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, adorned in eagle feathers and a beaded chestplate, he rode a painted horse with deliberate calm. The others did not move. The rider dismounted just yards from the cabin, his movement steady, powerful. The rancher raised the barrel of his rifle toward the door, his finger brushing the trigger, then froze when he saw her. The girl. She was beside the rider, standing close to him, her small hand clinging to his. Her face was calm now, no longer afraid, no longer lost. She looked straight toward the cabin as if urging him to come out. The rancher's stomach twisted. He lowered the rifle slowly, set it against the wall, and pushed open the door. The morning light spilled inside, blinding for a moment. When his eyes adjusted, he stepped onto the porch, every muscle tense. The rider, clearly a chief, watched him with piercing eyes, unreadable, unflinching. Around them, 300 warriors stood motionless, not a sound among them. The rancher had never felt so small, so utterly alone. The girl spoke first. Her English was still broken but clear enough. "You help me. Safe." The words carried across the silence, soft but powerful. She looked up at the chief, then back to the rancher, nodding as if to assure him he was not the enemy. The chief's gaze never wavered. His hand rested lightly on the girl's shoulder, his expression carved from stone. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice deep, resonant, carrying authority that made the air itself seem to bow. "Why?" he asked. Just one word. The rancher swallowed, his throat dry as dust. He could have lied. He could have said nothing. But with hundreds of eyes on him, honesty was all he had left. He straightened his back, his voice steady, though quiet. She was lost, he said. Alone. No one should be left alone. The words hung between them, suspended in the heavy silence. The chief studied him, unblinking. Then, slowly, he nodded once. Behind him, 300 warriors shifted slightly, a movement so unified it was like the wind rippling through tall grass. Still silent, still waiting. The rancher stood on his porch, rifle forgotten inside, his fate resting on the judgment of the man before him. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope, threatening to snap at any moment. The rancher could hear the faint creak of leather, the whisper of feathers stirring in the breeze, but no one spoke. 300 warriors stood like statues waiting for their chief's decision. The girl, her small hand still holding the man's shoulder, looked from the chief to the rancher, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but didn't dare. The chief's eyes bore into the rancher, dark and steady, the kind of gaze that seemed to pierce through bone into a man's very soul. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, until only a few feet separated them. You did not harm her, the chief said at last, his English thick but clear. She says you gave water, food, safe. The rancher nodded once. I did. The chief tilted his head slightly, studying him. Many would not. Many fear us. Many hate us. You. Why help? The rancher swallowed hard. He wanted to look away, but forced himself to meet the man's gaze. Because she was just a child, he said quietly. Lost, hungry, scared. I couldn't leave her to die. The chief's expression didn't change. His voice deepened, slow and heavy, carrying the weight of judgment. You know we could kill you right now. The rancher's grip on his hands tightened, though he kept them at his sides. I know, and yet you returned her. I did, the rancher replied, his voice firm. The chief studied him in silence, his broad shoulders unmoving, the eagle feathers in his hair swaying gently in the wind. Behind him the warriors remained utterly still, their weapons gleaming in the morning light. Finally the chief spoke again. A man's heart shows in what he does when no one is watching. You guided her. You gave your strength to protect her. Not for reward, not for glory, for nothing but the act itself. The rancher exhaled, tension tightening every muscle in his body. He had no defense but truth. I live alone, he said softly. Out here, all I have is myself. But no one, should have to be alone like that. The girl broke her silence then, her young voice trembling but determined. Father, she said, clutching the chief's hand. He good, he kind, not enemy. The chief's eyes flickered, and for the first time his stern face softened, if only slightly. He turned, addressing the warriors in his own tongue. His words rolled like thunder, deep and commanding. Murmurs rose from the ranks, low but not hostile. Then with a single sharp gesture, the chief raised his hand. The warriors shifted, lowering their weapons in unison, the sound of wood and metal settling, echoing like distant waves. The rancher stood frozen on his porch, hardly daring to breathe. He had expected death. Instead, he was being spared. No, more than spared, respected. The chief turned back to him. You are not like others, he said. You did not take. You gave. For that, we do not bring war. The girl smiled, her small face bright with relief. She stepped forward, pulling something from around her neck, the broken strand of beads she had worn when he first found her. She walked up to the porch, her bare feet silent on the wood, and pressed the necklace into his rough, calloused hand. For you, she whispered. The rancher looked down at the beads, then back at her. For the first time in years, something stirred inside him, something warmer than loneliness, stronger than fear. The chief gave a final nod, then turned to mount his horse. His warriors followed his movement like a tide, falling into motion without a sound, And just like that, the 300 melted back into the horizon, leaving the cabin standing small and silent once more. The rancher remained where he was, the beads resting in his palm, his heart still racing. He had faced death, and instead found honor. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless prairie. The rancher stood motionless on his porch, the morning sun warming his shoulders, the broken bead necklace still resting in his palm. He closed his fingers around it slowly, as though afraid it might vanish if he let go. For a long while, he remained there in silence. His cabin, once just a shelter against storms and loneliness, had become the center of a moment he would never forget. He had stared into the eyes of death and found instead something he had never known: respect. But the story was not over. That evening, as the sun slipped low and shadows grew long, the rancher stepped outside to bring in firewood. His gaze caught movement at the edge of the horizon. Figures approached once more. Not hundreds this time, but only a small group of riders. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning by the doorway. But as they drew nearer, he recognized the tall frame of the chief, his eagle, feathers catching the fading light. Behind him rode several warriors, and in their arms they carried bundles. The rancher set his rifle aside and stood firm as they stopped before the cabin. The chief dismounted and walked forward, his presence commanding yet calm. "You gave us back what cannot be replaced," he said, his deep voice carrying both weight and sincerity. "For this we give in return." At his gesture, the warriors stepped forward, laying down the bundles at the rancher's feet. He looked down and saw furs, thick and warm, stitched with care. Next came smoked meat wrapped in hide, baskets filled with dried berries and roots. A carved bow, polished smooth, and a quiver of arrows adorned with painted patterns, gifts not of pity but of honor. The rancher opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. No one had ever given him anything without expecting something in return. He had lived his life as an outsider, a man alone on the edge of town, whispered about but never truly known. Now before him, a people who had every reason to hate him instead stood offering gratitude. The girl appeared then, stepping down from one of the horses. Her small feet touched the ground lightly, and she walked straight to the rancher. She held something in her hands, a small pouch made of soft deer hide tied with a strip of leather. She placed it in his palm, just as she had given him the broken bead necklace that morning. When he untied it carefully, a simple token tumbled into his hand, a stone arrowhead smooth with age, bound in sinew to a cord. The chief spoke again. "This marks a friend. Wear it and our people will know your heart." The rancher stared at the arrowhead, his chest tight with emotion he couldn't put into words. Slowly, he slipped the cord around his neck. The stone rested against his chest, cold at first, then warm with his skin. The girl smiled at him, her eyes bright. "Not alone," she said softly. Those two words struck deeper than any gift, any honor. He felt the truth of them, sharp and undeniable. The chief placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Few men would do what you did. Fewer still would do it without fear or reward. You are not forgotten, rancher. You are known." The rancher nodded, his voice low but steady. "I only did what was right." The chief's gaze held his for a moment longer, then he stepped back. With a final gesture, the small party mounted their horses once more. The girl lingered for just a breath, waving to him with a shy, gentle smile before climbing onto her father's horse. As they rode away, the prairie grew quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. This silence felt different, full, not empty. It carried with it a strange comfort, a reminder that though he lived alone, he was no longer unseen. The rancher turned back to his cabin, the firelight flickering through the window. He carried the bundles inside, setting them carefully on the table. His hands lingered on the arrowhead at his chest, the beads in his pocket. For the first time in his life, he realized he had been given something greater than survival. He had been given respect, and in the endless loneliness of the frontier, that respect meant everything. The days that followed felt strangely different, though nothing outward had changed. The cabin still creaked in the wind, the cattle still wandered the same pastures, and the prairie still stretched wide and endless. Yet inside the rancher, something had shifted. Each morning when he rose, the necklace of beads lay on the table, its broken string carefully coiled. Around his neck hung the arrowhead, resting against his chest like a quiet promise. He touched it often without realizing, his fingers brushing the smooth stone, as if to remind himself it was real. In town, whispers grew. Some men spoke in hushed tones of how 300 warriors had surrounded his cabin, yet he still stood unharmed. Others doubted the tale, calling it foolish. But when they noticed the finely worked hides he now wore, or the bow that leaned near his hearth, the doubts fell silent. No one laughed at the virgin rancher anymore, yet he did not care for their opinions. What mattered were the memories he carried. The sight of a frightened girl drinking water from his canteen, the way she had clung to his arm beneath the cottonwoods, the soft words, "Not alone," spoken with the innocence of a child and the weight of a promise. At night, as he sat by the fire, he sometimes imagined what might have been had he turned away. The girl lost forever to the wilds. His cabin perhaps burned to the ground by men who thought he had stolen her. His life ended in violence, but he had chosen differently. He had chosen compassion over fear. And that choice had changed everything. The rancher knew he would likely never marry. The frontier was not a place that offered him such comforts. His life would remain one of hard work, quiet nights, and long, lonesome horizons. But he no longer felt invisible. Somewhere out there, beyond the rolling plains, an entire people knew his name, not as enemy, not as intruder, but as the man who guided a child home. It was a strange kind of companionship, unseen but powerful. He felt it in the stillness of the night, in the calls of wolves, in the rustle of the grass when the wind swept low. A reminder that even the loneliest life could touch another, that even a solitary man could leave a mark. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned with streaks of crimson, the rancher sat on his porch, the beads resting in his hand. He thought of the girl, her smile, her laughter, the way she had run back into her father's arms. He hoped she was safe, growing, living the life she deserved. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, but for the first time in his life, it did not feel empty. The rancher was still alone, but he was not forgotten. He had become something he never expected, a bridge between two worlds. A man remembered not for conquest, not for power, but for a single act of kindness that changed the course of many lives. And in the silence of the prairie, that was enough.